Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the American College of History and Legal Studies. It's great to see so many of you here this morning on a Saturday to hear from an expert on the Civil War. As you know, today's seminar is entitled The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. My name is Maureen Mooney. I'm the Associate Dean of the College, and at this time, I'm going to introduce the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law for some brief remarks. The Massachusetts School of Law is the creator of the American College, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dean Lawrence Velvel.
Hello, folks. Thank you. We'll see if you clap when I finish. Dubious in the extreme. How many of you, if any, have gone to our law school? Okay, so I'll try not to be too repetitive. We started the law school in 1988. Its object was to provide legal education and economic and social opportunity to people who were being frozen out in those days. I think we've succeeded very well. We have 3,000 graduates now. And a couple of years ago, and we use particular techniques which I think cause people to become far better intellectually, far better thinkers, far better readers, far better writers, far better speakers. And a few years ago we decided that we were going to bring those same techniques to undergraduate education. And let me mention, by the way, low price, because our price is only, our tuition's only $15,000 at the law school, when all around us it's 35, 40, 45, and 50,000 in New England. So we decided to bring the same techniques to undergraduate education in the hope of, providing opportunity to people, making them better thinkers, better speakers, better writers, and very importantly, giving them a knowledge of American history. I have never yet met a historian who does not think that Americans know far too little about their own history, and correlatively that this has an impact, most think an adverse impact, I believe, on what the country does politically, both domestically and internationally. So that was the hope in starting the ACHLS, where all the teaching, as in the law school, is discussion teaching, no lecturing, where there's 4 hours of writing a semester that is conjoined with the substantive courses, where there is no hiding because there's only a few students in a class and everybody is required to speak up every day in every way and on every subject. That's a slight exaggeration, but not much. And Mike Chesson and Andrea DeFusco-Sullivan, where are you, Andrea, are the folks who teach these people.
I'm here, Dean.
There she is. She's the writing teacher. So as part of our program here at the school, we're giving this Civil War seminar. Mike Chesson and I are joined at the hip when it comes to the Civil War. And I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Dean Velvel. I'm going to read now the biography of our speaker today, Dr. Michael Chesson. And it's so impressive that I have to read it so I don't miss any detail. So our seminar today will be led again by Dr. Michael Chesson. Michael Chesson was born in Richmond, Virginia, in the shadow of the White House of the Confederacy. He graduated from the College of William and Mary, magna cum laude, in history. After active duty in the U.S. Navy, from which he retired as a captain in the U.S. Navy Reserve, he began graduate work at the Johns Hopkins University with the late David Herbert Donald, following him to Harvard, where he got his Ph.D. He left the University of the Massachusetts, UMass Boston, where he was the senior Americanist in the Department of History and its former chair, after 32 years, to become both the founding professor and the dean of the American College of History and Legal Studies. He has written or edited 4 books and dozens of articles and book reviews. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michael Chesson.
Thank you, Maureen, and thanks for coming on Saturday morning. You should have a couple of handouts in your folders, and the first is some recommended reading, and this is not intended to be the 75 best books on the Civil War. It's a highly personal and idiosyncratic list, but I begin with some reference works and general histories, and then on pages 2, 3, and 4, what I've given you is many different types of history. So there's some regimental histories, there are monographs about women in the Civil War, about African American soldiers, various topics, economic history, diplomatic history. The Civil War is a universe all to itself, and it's connected with everything else in our history. And I preach big tent Civil War because no matter what you're interested in, for me, there's room under the tent. I'll be referring perhaps to some of those titles as we go along. The other handout, just one page, front and back. If you don't like history, or maybe you think you don't like history, probably because you haven't been exposed to really good history, maybe you prefer fiction, novels. This is a selection of Civil War novels, and again, written from different points of view, different topics, different periods, different theaters of the war, including the war within a war in Missouri, very violent, very bitter. Most of those books are available in paperback, and most of them you can get online. I hate to say this for independent booksellers, but you can get them from Amazon and other online vendors, and you can get them very inexpensively. Helen?
Don't forget Harvard Bookstore. You can get them, I'm sorry to interrupt. If you go to Harvard Bookstore, not the Coop, but the Harvard Bookstore on Mass Ave, they have this great big copier that if it's on Google, that you can get them from like $10, $20, and they're real paperbacks. And you can do it over the phone too. You don't have to actually go there. Sorry, it's just that we were talking about it on the way.
Would you tell them about Civil War news?
I would like to tell you about it. This is a newspaper that comes out 11 times a year. This, if you want to be up on what's going on, reenactments or preservation causes, this is the newspaper to have. And also, so I won't forget it, you will get a discount if you mention that you attended this seminar. And so don't forget to do that. But if you're interested, we have the name and address, we can give it to you. But for me, the best parts are the book reviews. But there's a lot of information, and it's been around for like 20 years, and I highly recommend it. It will give you a whole dimension of what's going on right now.
The publisher, I first met her at a Civil War forum hosted by Dean Velvo at the law school in Andover. And she's a friend of all things Civil War, as is Helen. Contrary to what Dean Mooney said, I'm not going to be the speaker today, but I do hope to be sort of the facilitator of a discussion. Some of you know a lot about the war, some of you know perhaps less, but you wouldn't be here if you didn't have an interest, perhaps a curiosity about the war. So I'm just going to throw out some simple questions, and then at the end there'll be a test. And my first question for all comers, what caused the Civil War? Slavery.
No. Secession.
Yeah, secession.
What caused secession?
States' rights.
States' rights. What rights were they protecting in particular?
They wanted to expand the slavery. The South wanted to expand slavery past the Mississippi River into the new territories. Abe Lincoln didn't have, from what I understand, didn't have a problem with the states where slavery existed. I mean, he didn't like the idea, but more than anything else, he wanted to stop the expansion beyond the Mississippi to the West Coast.
Actually, there's been a whole new movement that people are coming back that it was slavery that caused it, because in every state constitution, slavery was included. I haven't read it yet, but Eric Foner is kind of leading the presentation of it. Again, at one of Larry Belvo's Civil War seminars at the School of Law, James McPherson gave a really wonderful seminar, and he also brought up that people didn't want to admit that their ancestors were fighting for something like slavery, and so going for the lost cause was glorious, whereas going for slavery was not. This is all brand new that people are taking this theory. And so it's very exciting because it's exciting because it's changing what people have been saying for 100 years. And it's literally brand new. So if you've been saying states' rights, that's what everyone else has been saying for years. But it's going to be kind of interesting to see how it's responded to.
Someone else?
Yeah, didn't states' rights have something to do with this?
Well, explain.
Well, each state wanted to govern itself, have its own rules, not be forced into deciding to have slavery or not to have slavery, to govern themselves without the interference of the federal government. And I thought in all the books that I've read, that did enter a big portion of it. This gentleman brought it up.
Someone else? Dave?
Through an economist lens, in the South, their economic well-being, their quality of life, their living standards were predominantly dependent on an agricultural society, and having slave labor to go off and plant and tend and harvest the crops was great economic benefit. The idea of taking slavery away and forcing the landed gentry to have to pay for labor to harvest their crops to raise their costs of maintaining their cost of living probably had a very personal and financial incentive for the folks that were pro-slavery. And the idea that there were folks who were against it.
And pro-power too. I think they would have been the state legislators because they were the money people, so they would have been in politics. I agree that economics had a huge part to do with it because they had a model that was working for them. It wasn't working for the poor whites or for the African Americans, but
No.
it was working, and they were the ones in power in the South Carolina legislator and other legislators. That's what I believe.
Mary?
Yes, I think the economics, as you said, comes up to here, to New England and New York, everywhere, that a lot of people up here depended upon the cotton too for economic reasons, the shippers and certainly the mills and rolls. And that old saying, money loves money, or money likes money, money marries money. A lot of the North and the South, you know, it was good if a Southern belle married a Northern industrialist because of economic reasons.
I agree it's about economics too. It's really about economics. I think the Industrial Revolution was coming up, and slavery would not have worked for that, to have to take care of labor when it wasn't working. So I think it's strongly economics and about property rights also. But the new society, an industrialized society, could not operate the same way the agrarian society had been operating in the South. And so it just was not economical to maintain a workforce in a downtime. You know, you just wanted excess of labor. Anyway, that would have worked great for the North. In the industrialized part of the country, when they're not working, you don't pay them. They fend for themselves.
We saw that locally in mill strikes in Lawrence and Lowell and
Yes.
a lot of other mill towns. Well, how is it that you could have in the South in 1860 300,000 slaveholders, more or less, and 5.5 million white Southerners who owned no slaves? How does this equation lead to or allow for secession and war?
They use the media like we do today. They revved it up, you know, and made it everybody's patriotic duty to want to protect Virginia, protect Carolina, South Carolina. They had a deep love of their own state, too. And you're right, so many of them, look how many people fought in the Civil War that didn't own a slave. You know, but it was hyped. It was, I don't know, it's just an opinion. I don't have any, you know, I couldn't quote you a book right now that would say that, but.
Well, that's what I'm looking for. Were there state loyalties in the North? Did people love their states up here?
Yeah.
Well, some of them did, sure they did, but a lot of them were paid to go into the, you know, the Union Army, and when the war got going, a relative of ours who had a mother who grew up in the South, they were very afraid that England would come back in again. We forget that, you know, they weren't that far removed from the American Revolution themselves, with relatives fighting in that. And I don't know, sometimes I think today we're coming back to it because they don't want people to have a working wage. That's the way I feel now. I mean, for somebody to leave the state of Massachusetts and argue, oh, I can pay $2.50 in China an hour instead of $25 in Massachusetts an hour, and they're gone, and we help subsidize them, that's kind of sad. It's pretty sad.
What did you say, that money is married to money?
Yes, money seeks money. I know that.
I think the North was more, the North felt more as a region than individually. I mean, I think in the South you still had South Carolinians were South Carolinians, Mississippi, you know, where in the North you were New England, you were, if you were New York, you were a large state anyway, you were, with the economies, they were dependent on each other anyway. There was already more interstate commerce going on, you know, from DC up. And I think that had a huge factor in that the organization for the Union Army, besides the manufacturing, is that they felt, where in the states of the South, I think they felt more local, regional, you know, you could even say tribal to their states than as a, they didn't consider themselves, you know, like New England or the Mid-Atlantic. They were South Carolinians, you know, New Hampshire was a New Englander, you know. So I think that had part of it to do too with how you had the South fragment from the North and the North stay together.
Yeah, Mary Chesson, in her famous Diary from Dixie, or Mary Chesson's Civil War is the more recent version, she talks about a South Carolinian she knew, and this man said that when he went out, meaning when he went out for a fight, or when he went out to kill, you know, what's his number one priority? And it was the local part, his own neighborhood of a particular county. And then it was the county itself, and then it was the South Carolina upcountry, away from the coast, and then it was the state of South Carolina, and then it was the South. And at the bottom of his priority list, what he would fight for was the United States. I mean, their sense of loyalty was flipped, was reversed. And that's judgmental, I know, but think about 500 years from now, how people will judge the current inhabitants of the globe, so many of whom are intensely nationalistic, passionate about their nationalism.
Michael, I have a question for you.
Sure.
It follows along with Fagerstrom's point. I have often read that one of the reasons that the yeomanry, in short the poor whites, went along with all this, although they didn't in certain areas like the hill country of Alabama and the mountains of eastern Tennessee and West Virginia, what became West Virginia, that one of the reasons they went along with this is that people, just as is true today with the capitalist system, were so tied in with, economically with the big landowners. They made their livings off the big landowners who, as Mary pointed out, had all the money and all the power. Incidentally, that was one of the reasons why it is said that Robert E. Lee rejected Porter Alexander's plea to turn to guerrilla warfare after Appomattox, because Lee was afraid that the wrong crowd would come into power due to a guerrilla warfare. But anyway, the question is, what percentage of the southern population was really tied in economically with the big plantation owners?
Well, it's much larger than the actual slave ownership numbers would suggest. Because generally the slave owner on the slave census of 1860 is the head of household. He's the married father and husband. He may be a grandfather, it may be an older son, but each one of those slaveholders has an extended family. I mean, spouses and children and cousins and brothers and sisters. So there is a web of relationships tied to each one of those slaveholders. So the slave interest or the slave power, as William Lloyd Garrison would have called it, right over your head there, the great Newburyport abolitionist. The slave power is much more extensive. It's a much larger proportion of the white population in the South than you would guess just from the relatively small number of slaveholders. The exact percentage, I don't know, but slavery is like AIDS. It's like cancer. It spreads everywhere. It's a monster. And it is very hard to root out. It's very hard to exterminate. It's very hard to get rid of. You think about the sacrifice in this country during those 4 years. It destroyed a good part of the South, and the number of homes that have lost one or more loved ones. And then just before he's murdered, Lincoln in his second inaugural, he's saying that we are all being punished for the sin we have committed as a nation. You know, every drop of blood drawn by the sword to compensate the blood drawn by the slaveholder's lash.
The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether.
He knew his Bible. He had memorized the book of Matthew, Luke, Proverbs. He corrected ministers when they quoted scripture to him. He's an incredible individual. What he believed is open to question. But he certainly knew his Bible and he knew how to use it. He used it as a vehicle to reach ordinary Americans, Americans who were much more biblically literate back then, a much bigger percentage of the population than is perhaps true today.
And Shakespeare.
He knew Shakespeare. If you remember the last lines in Romeo and Juliet, the Duke is coming in, Romeo is dead, Juliet is dead. They're simply the last of a whole bunch of deaths between the Montagues and the Capulets, and the Duke is furious. They're all related to him, they're all his cousins. And he says, I have lost a brace of kinsmen because of your stupidity, your violence. And he says, all are punished. All are punished. That's what Lincoln is thinking, I believe, as he delivers his second inaugural. Frederick Douglass was in the audience. Douglass said, we have just heard a sermon. That's a sermon. He's giving us hell. The crowd came expecting to hear a victory speech, and what they get is a Jeremiah. The Puritans loved that prose form. They loved sermons delivered by their preachers, Jeremiahs, because Jeremiah, an Old Testament prophet, as you know, he would lay down the law. He would give those Israelites hell for violating it. That's what Lincoln is doing in March of 1865. Ellen.
I recently read an account of a woman from Michigan who was a distributor of sanitary commission goods. When she first went there, she was only going to be giving these goods to Michigan people. They were raised by Michigan people and for Michigan people. And then when she saw all the suffering, she couldn't just keep it. She still kept looking for Michigan people. But it kind of ties in, I think, with the whole change the United States of America is versus are, which was the big thing. Shelby Foote has that. They're going to repeat the Civil War series, by the way, I think starting Sunday. But this was a great revelation for this woman that she shouldn't just think about Michigan. And so this was happening everywhere. This was in the North. I mean, they were changing their views too. And so it was, well, I'm preaching to the choir here, but this was such a huge rupture in our country that it's like nothing else that we've ever, I guess, a revolution in this. I mean, World War I and World War II were important, but they didn't change our whole psyche.
Yeah, Foote said this was a crossroads of our being. What happens between 1861 and 1865 decides what kind of country we're going to be, decides what direction we're going to go in. This is a huge family quarrel, bloodiest war we've ever had by far. And instead of Americans killing the enemy, Americans are killing other Americans. Fratricidal conflict. The best place to see what Helen was alluding to, and this woman from Michigan, is to look at the Union Army itself. Each company that made up each regiment in the Union Army, the volunteers who joined up in 1861, are coming from little communities or a particular precinct or ward in a big city, but they're local boys. And the names they gave their companies and initially their regiments reflect these local attachments. The 20th Massachusetts is unusual in some respects in that it's recruited from all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There are people there from the islands, there are people there from Boston, Cambridge, but most regiments are recruited from a particular county, particular part of a state, little towns in that county. And by 1865, they've been nationalized. You see regimental names, regimental designations changing from a state name to 87th U.S. Regiment, 87th National Regiment. State and regional and local loyalties, affiliations are being wiped out. Somebody's called it the Prussian Road. We're on the way now to becoming a great nation state, modern industrial power. Just like the German principalities, 38, 36 little German states are forged together by Bismarck into Germany. And his approach was called blood and iron, but he didn't spill a fraction of the blood that we spilled unifying.
Michael, I have read that some incredible fraction of the Union Army, well, the Southern Army too, had never been more than 10 miles from their home when they went away to war. One question is whether that's accurate, and another one is, in those days when regiments would lose 80 and 85% of their men sometimes, it's unbelievable. People would be cashiered today if something like that ever happened. The first Minnesota at Gettysburg, was one of those regiments that saved the day, lost 85% of their men on a charge.
There's a title on page 3 of the handout, Richard Moe, The Last Full Measure of Devotion, The Life and Death of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers. If you can read that without tears in your eye, the last few pages, you're a better man than I am.
Well, here's the question that arises from that. Was it the Civil War or World War I that caused the Army to reorient itself so that no longer did battalions, companies, regiments, and so forth come from a particular town, lest the men in that town get wiped out, as happened to Bedford, Virginia, in the Second World War on D-Day?
Bedford boys, yeah.
So was it the Civil War or the First World War?
It's both. I mean, some state identifications do persist. So the Richmond Light Infantry Blues is a private military club in Richmond that is founded just after Gabriel's Revolt, the slave conspiracy in Richmond in 1800. And they are organized to respond to emergencies, to crises, including slave insurrections. And they joined the Confederate Army as a regiment in 1861. And they're still around as a regiment in the Virginia National Guard in World War I and World War II. But after, I think immediately after World War II, that identification is done away with. So it is gradual to some extent, but the big change, the big push begins during the Civil War. 2 million men served, some of them for only a day, some of them for 4 years, in the Union Army. We've got 1 million men in the Union Army on June 1st of 1865, and by December 1st, they have been virtually all demobilized, sent home. We fight a big war, and then we downsize. That's the peace dividend that we're all hoping for. I've seen orders. If you look in the official records of the Union, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, by the way, the War of the Rebellion, that's the official name to this conflict given the U.S. Congress. It's been called many things, but It's the War of the Rebellion for any good Yankee. And there are orders by Grant being written in May and June of 1865 saying, don't spend any more money on this, that, or the other thing. In Washington now, it's all about cutting, cutting, cutting.
Professor, not
Yes.
to retrograde, but we were talking about the economical side, but I do believe that there was a social side as far as why people were fighting, and I think the Civil War was unusual in that it brought two groups of people together for the same cause. There really were people who were morally against slavery, a lot of people, but it brought them with the other side who had their own interests, which were economic. We're talking about the economics of it, but it brought those people that had social concerns, the Northern abolitionists, who were really about the moral issue. It kind of joined them with the new Republican Party that was really about economics. And I thought that was an interesting aspect. And also the social part as far as poor Southerners. They had aspirations. Of course, they were economically tied to the Southern system anyway, but they also had aspirations. It was their way of life. And they had aspirations of probably being slave owners one day in their society. So,
And if not them, their children.
oh, their children. So
The chance for their children to rise.
So it's a very strong. There is that social side as well. When I sometimes we have these discussions. I don't want to because people say, well, Lincoln wasn't concerned with slaves. He was concerned with the economics, and I can appreciate that. But also that there were those other people who were really concerned, and it always, of course, had been an issue with slavery right from the beginning. When they were trying to draft the Constitution, when they were doing the Articles of Confederation. So there were people that were concerned right from the beginning, that were always concerned. And I don't mean to downplay that part. It's
Yeah.
all economics and not.
I think the biggest impact the abolitionists had was not in the North, but in the South. They terrified white Southerners. By 1860, most of these people who, as Dean Belleville said, had not been 10 miles from home in their entire life, they were convinced that all Northerners were like John Brown, that all Northerners were radical abolitionists, that they had supported John Brown in his raid on Harper's Ferry, and that they were going to free the slaves. But it was also clear, if you looked at the laws in Massachusetts, in Kansas, in Indiana, and Illinois, that white Northerners did not want blacks, free or slave, living with them. So what would white Southerners conclude? That Northerners wanted to free their slaves, but expected that the free blacks would then stay right where they were in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and Virginia. That was a nightmare from their point of view. That was something they could not get their arms around. They could not conceive of it, which is why so many of them were willing to fight. Most of the adult male population of the South, ultimately, something like 60, 70% or higher in some states, was in the Confederate Army.
Weren't they true in their thoughts, though? It took 100 years to get equal rights. I mean, you think about the war ends 1865, you don't have until Johnson in 1964 really saying that you're an American citizen and you need to be treated. You know, it takes 80 years to get from the Constitution to the Civil War, and another 100 years.
You're exactly right. We had a debate in this class last night between the students. Some of them were taking the side that school busing in Boston in the 1970s was justified, that federal judge Arthur Garrity was doing the right thing, that much good came out of school integration, or could have come out of it if it hadn't been resisted so violently. And the other side was saying, no, the forced integration of Boston schools set education back a generation. One debater said 100 years. That it failed, that it's been a failure from the get-go, and that it didn't work, and that kind of approach by a federal judge acting as a kind of dictator will never work. And I don't know what the debaters actually believed, because to some extent they were role-playing. One took the affirmative side and one took the negative side. But it was a knockdown, drag-out debate in here. all facilitated by Professor DeCusco Sullivan.
You know, Michael, apropos of the Southerners' fear that the North wanted to free the slaves and have them stay right where they were, that's what happened. And that's what happened until the Great Migration started around 1915 and 1920. There's a wonderful book that's just been written about it, which I read. Well, Al, do you remember? I told you about it. What's the name of the book by that Boston reporter about the Great Migration?
Warmth of Another Sun, I think it is.
The Warmth of Another Sun. You want to read a great book? Get The Warmth of Another Sun. And now, of course, I read that just like all the Jews in Florida are going back to New York because it's much easier to, go to Christini's and it's right downstairs. So too, a lot of the African Americans in California, the West and the North, are going back to the South because it's a better place to live, in their opinion.
I can see at least two of you on the line. Why don't you come on in? There's a seat here and a seat in the far corner.
Yeah.
Come on in, please. Join us.
Thank you, Professor Chesson.
Okay.
I will ask a question.
So this is a case, Michael, dare I say, this is a case that it exemplifies why we created the History College. So that people will learn, among other things, that there are patterns in history, and here we have, a pattern reversing itself. And yet for the same reason, people want a better life.
If you look at the next to last title on page 2, Charles B. Dew. He has taught history for a generation at Williams College, a wonderful scholar. He's written a number of important books. The Apostles of Disunion is his shortest book, and it may prove to be his most important. It's, I'm guessing, less than 200 pages. Apostles of Disunion, Southern Secession Commissioners and the Causes of the Civil War. The secession commissioners were appointed by the Provisional Confederate Government. The first states to secede, from South Carolina to Texas. Texas is out by, I think it's March 1st of 1861. The Provisional Government of the Confederate States of America sent commissioners to the slave states that had not seceded. So various commissioners are going to Maryland, they're going to Missouri, they're going to Kentucky, they're going to Delaware. That's kind of a stretch. The northern county of Delaware, Delaware only has 3 counties. Rhode Island has 5. The northernmost county in Delaware is Newcastle County, and that's where Wilmington, Delaware is. Can you guess how many slaves were in Newcastle County in 1860? It was the most industrialized, the only industrialized part of that little state. But they had a visit from secession commissioners, and what the secession commissioners are telling the white people in those border slave states is join us, secede, help us win the war that's coming, because if you don't, you're going to lose your slaves. The Lincoln government, the abolitionists that are in control of that government, you can tell what a fantasy that was. The abolitionists had no political part at all. I mean, they're not elected officials, with very few exceptions. But the secession commissioners put it in black and white. And Dew has edited those documents, had them published. Anyone who thinks this wasn't about slavery, they haven't read Dew's book.
Question about the Fugitive Slave Act, and it's where that came from and how that affected this Civil War.
The first Fugitive Slave Act is in our Constitution. It doesn't mention slaves from slavery, but it talks about fugitives from service, fugitives from labor, and all the states, all 13 colonies, new states, are obliged to honor the extradition treaty that is, in a sense, a clause in our Constitution. So if your slave runs away to another state, officials, authorities in the other state are obliged to return that slave. The last Fugitive Slave Act is an important component of the Compromise of 1850. And this is a Fugitive Slave Act that has some teeth in it. Because if you do not help the marshals, federal marshals, and the local constables and authorities in your town or your county up here in Massachusetts or New Hampshire, there are criminal penalties for not helping return that fugitive to the South, to his owner. There are about 250,000 free blacks living in the northern states. And some of them have been here since the colonial era. In Boston, historic black community. So in some cases, free blacks are being assaulted, apprehended, kidnapped, taken south. And there are special judges appointed under the 1850 Compromise, the Slave Act. You bring the fugitive before you, and the judge is going to decide whether or not this individual is a free black, long resident in Connecticut or Massachusetts or New Hampshire, or whether he or she is in fact a fugitive slave. If the judge decides that this individual is a fugitive slave, he'll be paid $10. If he decides, no, this individual is a free black, he's paid $5.
And that was real money, $10. $300 is a union,
For a year.
laboring man's yearly wage.
And for $300, you could buy a substitute to serve in your place in the Union Army.
That's true, too.
Grover Cleveland did it. Abraham Lincoln provided an acceptable substitute. No one expected the commander-in-chief to pick up a rifle and actually serve in the trenches in the Union Army, but he did it as an example.
Didn't a lot of the Northerners, weren't a lot, at least I read, that a lot of Northerners were very upset because this impressed them, in the sense of the British dragooning people off of ships, impressed them into cooperating with something they thought a moral evil.
I don't follow that question.
Well, I had read, take Garrison, whose classic statement, I think, in these days when we're all told to revere the Constitution, and particularly the original intent, and Garrison's motto, written at the top of the Liberator, his newspaper, just like the New York Times says, all the news that fits to print, was speaking of the Constitution because of what Michael, the provisions Michael has alluded to, called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And a lot of people, that's a classic statement, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell.
Not only did he call it that, he burned the Constitution all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He burned it on Boston Common. My generation went out and burned our draft cards. He burned the U.S. Constitution.
But like Garrison, I had read that a lot of Northerners considered the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced them to cooperate with the posses, forced them into cooperating with what they considered as immorality, and they were quite aggravated.
And northern states, Michigan and others, passed liberty laws. So in the state of Michigan, you do not have to obey the federal law. You do not have to conform to the Compromise of 1850.
Massachusetts too.
Massachusetts, of course. Is that states' rights? You know, who do we owe our highest allegiance to? Whose law do we obey? Do we follow U.S. law or state law?
It's nullification, plain and simple.
And maybe it's the
Which
law
some
of
states want to
God.
do today.
Maybe most people felt it was the law of God, you know? And, you know, the abolitionists to follow God's law first before state or nationalism.
Well, there were statements in Congress, statements during the 1850s by William Seward. In the debates on the Compromise of 1850, Seward, governor of New York, then a United States senator, lifelong politician, career politician, he gets up to the floor of the United States Senate and says there is a higher law than the Constitution. Now, that is a statement that is going to haunt him because it brands him unfairly as a radical. Now, by 1860, he is not nearly as conservative. He's not the man he was in 1850. He's changed. He's evolved. If you're an out-and-out abolitionist, you would say, well, he's deteriorating. You know, he's going away from moral law, from God's law, and more toward man's law. But he said there was a higher law. He implied that he had a direct line to the Creator. His colleagues in Congress, some of them were not as holy as he was. this kind of self-righteousness or better than thou attitude, it kind of grates on some folks. And it made Seward a divisive figure.
We see it now in politicians.
Oh, yeah, we see it now.
Look at the primary coming up.
Oh.
Well, we're in here, the cockpit of politics in New Hampshire. We are going to have the first primary up here, regardless of what the sovereign state of Florida does. Mary.
I watched the nightly business report, you know, and I think, is it the New York Stock Exchange that's either sold or recently sold?
To the Germans?
To the Germans, right, and they had the head of the New York Stock Exchange, and I went crazy because he actually said, whatever the question was the girl asked him, he said about the global economy, and it really won't affect us because, you know, we do this business already now, and so we just move, you know, over there and all this and that. And he says, people are gonna have to get over their nationalism. He actually said that this is the new global order, and people are gonna have to get over their nationalism. Well, my Irish was up at that statement.
A
I
new
like
world
my
order.
nationalism.
Hitler used that term, a new world order.
I'm not sure if he said that, but he did say people have to get over their nationalism. And I just went, shoo, he really said that.
Think of the United Federation of Planets. Think of
Star Trek.
Actually, I think that is what's happening with communication going so quickly.
It is,
Yeah,
but
right, look
still.
at businesses. Look at
still-
American businesses.
Yeah, I
They're
mean,
not American
I
at all.
don't find it that surprising that he said that. If he said it at that tone,
Well,
that's
if you
one thing.
carry it further, then our troops are just gonna be global soldiers of war. They're already paid. You know, and I think we'll find maybe when we don't manufacture anything, it's a bit going against our nationalism if you carry that thought to the extreme, that we can't even make a bolt that goes on a nuclear sub. And what happens if the bolt isn't manufactured?
I look at manhole covers, it says India.
I haven't seen that yet.
A Navy captain was relieved of his command some years ago because on the anchor, on the bow of the ship, you could see in big letters on the anchor, Korea. U.S. Navy, anchors made in Korea.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
well, the thing is, I think you're responding to the same way that people, well,
I
not
could
my
be.
state first,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
my county first. I mean, it's just that it's just such a foreign idea to us, and but you know, between the communication and everything else, as people were just saying, Star Trek and all
Yeah,
that.
the communication
Yeah.
should bring us together.
And English is becoming more and more a common language. It's always the second language they're taught. You know, it's none of us know what's going to happen. I see you want to say something. So, but it's. I think you're experiencing what they were experiencing
No, I
at
could
that
be.
time.
You know, I'm an old dog. What can I say?
Jim?
Getting back to the 1850s, you talked earlier about the fear of the Southerners, of the abolitionists. I think the fear in the North was also quite a motivating factor for me. Started with the Fugitive Slave Act. All of a sudden you have federal government sanctioning intrusion in the northern states. 1854, the Anthony Burns fugitive slave case in Boston. You have thousands of people coming from all over Massachusetts and probably New Hampshire as well, willing to go for that higher law theory and say, heck with the federal government. And the president himself, Pierce, supports the Southern cause, sends military up there to make sure they get Burns out. And the Dred Scott case follows that up, and all of a sudden it's okay to bring your slave anywhere you want. And the Northerners are starting to fear, you know, the administration in Washington's been in the back pocket of the Southerners now for 3 straight administrations.
Right.
If we don't strengthen this Republican Party and get one of our own people in there, where's it going to lead to? Are we going to have slavery in the North as well?
Davis said in 1850 that he should have the right to take his slaves, his servants, to Newport or to Saratoga when he went on vacation in the summers to cool off, wherever he wanted in the North. But he feared doing it. He couldn't risk losing his valuable property. He said if we had been 2 separate nations in 1850, we would already have just cause for declaring war in the North. We had enough grievances, we had enough damage that had been done to us. Declaration of war would be justified.
Can I ask you a question, Michael? Somebody here mentioned today, and one reads it all the time, that
maybe the Southerners shouldn't have been so angry about Lincoln's position that the slavery where it is, that can stay, but you can't expand it. And the idea has been, well, you know, if slavery really wasn't fit for the Great Plains, for industry, it wouldn't have expanded. I have never, and I'm asking what your opinion on my belief. I have never believed that, because if you look at South Africa, the mines were all worked by slaves, or de facto slaves. And if you look at industry in the South, for example, slave owners used to hire out their slaves to work in industry. So I don't think there's anything that is done, except perhaps high order physics, that, you know, you couldn't do with slaves, and that Lincoln and the rest of the North was absolutely right about that. My question is, what's your opinion?
Slavery was an enormously malleable institution. It's very adaptable. It changes shape. So the slaves can be rented out, hired out, leased out. Slaveholders in Virginia who didn't have enough for their slaves to do, whose farms and plantations were declining, they had a surplus of slaves, send them into Richmond. During the holidays, between Christmas and New Year's, slaves would line up a particular block in downtown Richmond to hire themselves out, anyone looking for a cook, a butler, a chauffeur, a coach driver, whatever. And they would often interrogate the white person, trying to figure out, is he or she going to be a good person to work for the next year? So they're working for someone who has made an arrangement with their owner out in the country, and they're sending most or all of their wages to their actual owner out in the county while living in the city. Question?
Rob Josephs.
Rob.
Can I bring this back to a little bit to the origins of the Civil
Sure,
War?
sure.
If I may. Been thinking lately about the comparisons between the presidential election of 1828 and 1980, actually. I believe, and maybe you could comment on this, is that the rejection of John Quincy Adams' philosophies over Andrew Jackson's philosophies have basically set the die for the Civil War. Adams, who wanted equality for women, blacks, Indians, Jackson, who rejected that idea and had the Trail of Tears. That idea as a philosophy being accepted by the populace created seeds, or made it almost, the Civil War almost inevitable 30 years later. So,
Well, the Trail of Tears actually takes place under Martin Van Buren.
right, but
The government of the United States, the Congress, the people of the United States, if they didn't want those Native Americans moved from their ancestral homes, they could have stopped it. Andrew Jackson was an Indian killer. He also killed British and Canadians and a bunch of other nationalities and all races, maybe not Asians. He is bloody, and he goes to his grave with a number of bullets in him. But Democrats, Jackson, think about Jackson's position on states' rights.
well,
Jackson's
he wanted
position
to
on the Union.
hang Calhoun. For
Yeah, and the nullification crisis in
Yeah.
1831. Here's a commander-in-chief who really is a commander-in-chief. He said he would lead the U.S. Army to South Carolina, and he would hang Calhoun from the highest tree. And who backs down in that situation?
Calhoun, but Zachary Taylor also did almost a similar situation some 20 years later, and he was a slaveholder.
He was a career U.S. Army officer, and he had a plantation, a sugar plantation in Louisiana. Yeah.
Yeah, and he did the same exact thing. He was going to hang separatists. Or
If Zachary Taylor had not providentially died in the summer of 1850, he went to the dedication of the cornerstone laying of the Washington Monument. He sat out in the sun for 4 hours with no hat and no shade. And he came back and he asked the slave servants in the White House to fix him a big bowl of iced cherries and milk. And he drank this in concoction, and in 4 days he was dead. Cholera morbus. He's replaced by that household name, Millard Fillmore. You think about Millard Fillmore, you don't even have to know what he looked like. But think about the Pillsbury Doughboy. You punch him in the tummy and he giggles. Well, that's what President Fillmore was like. Just don't hurt me. don't threaten me, don't yell at me, I'll do whatever you want, whatever bill Congress sends up to me, I'll sign. And that's how we get our compromise of 1850. If Zachary Taylor had lived, the war might have started 11 years sooner. He was bound and determined to get California in the Union, and unfortunately that map doesn't cover the fighting in California. There were some skirmishes there. But he's going to get California into the Union as a free state and secure a good part of what is now the west coast of the United States. And California is going to be a free state. And he's a slaveholder. And how do you explain that? He's attacked by Southerners, by slaveholders across the region as a traitor to the South. How could he betray his interest in slavery by bringing California into the Union as a free state? Our history is so full of contradictions and complications.
I'm kind of on the same page with Rob that I think the Civil War started with the Jackson administration, not because of what he mentioned, but there was a second term of the central bank that they were trying to establish for the U.S. Central Bank, and Jackson struck it down.
The Bank of the United States.
Yes.
Nicholas Biddle.
The second 20-year term ended.
That was a war to the death, and Jackson referred to him as Old Nick. He implied that Biddle was the devil incarnate. And he crushed the Bank of the United States and was censured for doing it by the U.S. Congress.
And Justice Marshall had just died, I think a year or two before he struck, he ended that second term of the 20-year.
Died in 1835.
But here's the federal government's trying to get control of the money supply, and Jackson kills it. And that's, to me, when the Civil War started.
That's part of his personal history. Jackson had lost a small fortune. He lost his life savings at a bank in early life. He hated banks, didn't trust banks. He certainly didn't want a big national bank. Jackson, in many ways, is a localist. He's certainly an individualist. But when push comes to shove, and it concerns the Union, and he takes down Calhoun and he takes down Nicholas Biddle, anybody who gets in his way, Jackson is going to confront and take on.
Let me ask you this question, and this is something that historians have been spilling a lot of ink on for many years, and it goes back to the beginning of the war. And we've had some good discussions here about, some of the causes of the war, what brought the war on, slavery, the economic issue, states' rights, and so forth. Do we accept it as a priori that the Civil War was inevitable, that it was an irrepressible conflict, and that the only way we could deal with the issues in the 1860s was, by a bloody Civil War? And if not, what other options could there have been to try to resolve these issues without, having to consign?
That's a good question, Jim.
600,000 men to the death?
He's absolutely right. Several generations of historians have been debating this question. Was the Civil War inevitable? Could it have been avoided? Yeah.
I think so,
Erin.
because right from the beginning, with Virginia and then Massachusetts, you had completely two different sets of people. Virginia was, gentry and nobles who had no idea what the hell they were doing. The first generation of them died completely until you had the younger sons come in. And then when they started getting healthier, indentured servants became less economically profitable because they were living so much longer. So that's when slavery became important. And also because when you let an indentured servant out of service, you had to give them a gun, which of course Bacon's Rebellion didn't end so well. So it was safer to have slaves and it was more economical for them. But in Massachusetts, the Puritans, they weren't really, they were sort of middle class, but they weren't quite gentry, and they had learned previously from the problems in Virginia and with the Pilgrims. So it was just a completely different set of circumstances, and of course completely different ideas of what life was like. I mean, the Puritans were looking for the ideal society. And I don't think slavery would have been a part of that at all. Because they were, they were trying to live to glorify God and stuff like that. So I don't think they could have resolved it any other way, really.
Someone else? Could we have avoided this?
What's the Southern perspective, if I can put you on the spot?
Today, I don't know that there is a single perspective. You got PhDs, pointy-headed liberals in their ivory tower academic dens, and you got the broad mass of the population.
All right, then, what's your personal feeling as a scholar? I mean, what do you think, was war irrepressible or not?
It's a question that philosophers have wrestled with. It's a question of, I guess, I don't know, logic, or how would you, if you were trying to do a scientific proof in a laboratory, one way to confirm your theory, or one way to confirm that you have in fact invented cold fusion or whatever, is to have a completely independent group of researchers in another laboratory replicate your results. They do the experiment exactly the same way, they use the same ingredients, and they're trying to produce the exact same results. Now, how would you prove or disprove the inevitability of an historical event?
You can't.
You can't.
It's counterfactual history.
Yeah.
And yet, part of my interest in being here today is to see if there aren't connections between the American Civil War and what we see happening in the Arab world today, and the contrast between in Egypt, where there's been a relatively peaceful revolt resulting in an overthrow of a leader, a forthcoming change in government without a civil war of bloodshed, and right next door you have Libya, where it's very divided and it appears a country inevitably headed towards civil war. And I guess that becomes one of my other questions, is in the American Civil War, how did the rest of the world see as which was the legitimate government, or didn't they care? Did the rest of the world divide Union versus Confederate and support one or the other but not both, or were they economic opportunists and say, you know, we still want to import industrial revolution goods from the north, we still want to import cotton from the south, we'll take it any way we can get it.
Arthur, can you address that?
One of the things that I heard is that, well, first of all, England and Russia had just finished a very expensive war in the Crimea. They had properties that they wanted to get rid of, and they were willing to sell them to get money, because the war is a war and cost. The other thing, too, is that I think the South figured that with the cotton, that Great Britain had put a lot of pressure on the North. Great Britain went around the corner and bought the cotton from Egypt.
They also revived the textile industry and the cotton business in India.
Right. And the other thing that I have heard, and I guess there's probably more than one side to it, the fact that the British and the French were both waiting to see the outcome of Gettysburg. And they were, if the South had won, there was a good chance that they were going to come in on the side of the South and affect the war at another level.
There's certainly evidence that suggests them sliding that direction. If you look at Frank Owsley's King Cotton Diplomacy, was revised by his daughter, came out in a second edition in 1959. Professor Owsley, major historian for a generation, he did what most American diplomatic historians and most Civil War historians have not done. He actually went to the British Public Record Office. And he spent weeks and months going through cabinet papers, going through minutes of debates in the cabinet and in the parliament, and he was trying to figure out whether there was some sort of a quid pro quo that with the English textile industry, and to some extent the French textile industry, in desperate need of southern cotton, which was not getting to them because of the increasing Union blockade of the southern coast, did the threat of withholding northern wheat, did Lincoln and Seward threaten Her Majesty's government with starvation? You know, if they intervened, if they gave full diplomatic recognition to the Confederacy and even sent troops to America, was the North going to withhold its grain and stop shipping wheat to the UK? And that has been a theory that's been around, and it's still around. It's around because people haven't read Professor Owsley's book. Because in going through the primary sources and going through the minutes of cabinet debates and the debates in Parliament, never once did northern wheat get mentioned. Never once did grain being shipped from the north to Great Britain come up. Nor was Great Britain dependent on American wheat. What Great Britain was doing was buying wheat and other grain where it was cheapest. And when the grain prices went down in Poland and Russia, they started buying a little closer to home.
Did he talk about cotton?
He certainly talked about cotton. Cotton, there was a cotton shortage. There was a cotton crisis.
Did that come up in a cabinet meeting?
It did. You have hundreds of thousands of unemployed mill workers, their families, on the verge of starvation, no work, no jobs. The only way to support themselves, prostitution. And the British government decided it was cheaper to put these unemployed mill workers on the dole, bread and water, on a regular basis, than to intervene in a war where Great Britain had no vital interest, and intervene in a war where it might not turn out the way Great Britain had expected.
Can I add something which relates to what Dave builds on what you...
Yeah.
One of the amazing things people have said is that the starving textile workers lined up on the side of the North. And that in itself probably relates, Richard Cobden, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That in itself probably relates to their understanding, as Jim, what's his name, put it in one of his books. McPherson, an Irish Union soldier replying to his family in Ireland that this fight is Ireland's fight. Amazing statement. And Ireland, of course, was on the other side from England. But they understood this was for freedom in the world. And Lincoln, you should, if you don't mind, elaborate on this when I get done in 1 second. Lincoln understood. You know, there were the revolutions of 1848, which got crushed. And of course, you know, was similar to what happened in Tsarist Russia in 1905 and so on. They understood that. That's why Lincoln said this is the last best hope of mankind. And when you think about it, slavery in the world context, I have read, at least, Mike, that the reason slavery was done away peacefully in Brazil and other parts of Latin America about 20 years later,
1881.
yeah, was that the population of those countries was so heavily African-based. Whereas in the United States, the slaveholders had such fantastic power that it would be too much to say they thought they were immune from the laws of history, because they didn't consider the laws of history were against slavery. But it was all a question of relative power, whereas in the rest of the world, slavery was going downhill. And indeed, during the Civil War, a little known fact that was written about in Civil War times or something, the Tsar, after fighting England and France in 1856, sent his fleet to New York Harbor. Kind of a warning to the British. So there were all these things that were playing. Would slavery have been gotten rid of in the long term? 40 years, as some people say, when the rest of the world was all getting rid of it, and when England and France would have had a terrific fight on their hands, and you know, if we had anything to do with it, well, if you fought America, the wheat would be cut off. But then Mike is saying, well, yeah, but there was wheat elsewhere. Anyhow, maybe you want to address something.
There are alternative sources. Richard Cobden and John Bright, some of these English liberals who were pro-Union and pro-Lincoln and pro-freedom, they had no influence in the British government, even the ones that served in Parliament. They're quite unpopular with the British upper class, with the aristocracy, because they're anti-monarchist. So they have very little leverage. They have very little juice as far as affecting the policy of the British government.
Michael, just to follow on to what Dean Velvel was saying, in taking a quick look at the slave trade as it was going on, you mentioned peaceful resolution of slavery in Brazil, but one of the concerns is, with what little I have seen, is of all these West African slave trade, probably less than 10% of it came to the United States. The vast majority of it went either to the Caribbean or to the South, and the largest single importer of slaves was in Brazil. And I'm not so sure, but my guess is the indigenous people of Brazil were probably not slave owners and not involved in this, so it was the Portuguese that had colonized Brazil, and it, given the quantities there, very well could be that the slave population outnumbered the Portuguese colonists, and you could end up with peaceful resolution of slavery as an issue that way.
It's been estimated that only 5% of the total number of slaves shipped over in the transatlantic slave trade arrived in British North America, arrived in the 13 colonies or the later United States before the trade was banned in 1808. Only 5% of 10 million.
I had, just to what you were relative to what you're saying, I heard something like 6% have gotten in, but one of those reasons is because the U.S. Navy had patrol vessels off the West African coast that were catching these people. They were putting the crew of the ships in chains, bringing them back to the States. Well, the owners got special treatment, but the slaves, the African slaves, weren't taken back to the land they just come from. They were taken to Libya because they were afraid that the slavers would go right back in there, get the people, and bring them over on another boat. But that's maybe one of the reasons why a whole lot of them didn't get back to someplace like the States, because the Navy was there. And as a matter of fact, the second part of that is the fact that there was conflicts going on between the sailors about pro-union and pro-slavery at that point.
Let me ask another question. You've done so well on origins and causes. Why did the Confederates fire in Fort Sumter?
Provocation, I think. Try and get the Union to make it take a stand one way or the other.
Southern historians like Charles Ramsdell years ago argued that Lincoln tricked the South into firing in Fort Sumter. Mary?
What about the fire eaters? Weren't they, is that the term for them?
Who were the fire eaters?
Well, there were a group of Southerners that wanted secession, I think. Didn't they control the Democratic Party down there and the National?
In South Carolina, there was only one party.
Yeah, yeah. But they were very conniving and wanted to, accelerate things.
You think about the abolitionists up here, the other side of that coin is the fire eaters. They're pro-slavery, pro-states' rights fanatics, and they're determined to take their states out of the Union, and some of them have been trying since the nullification crisis, 1828, 1831, thereabouts. They don't command the majority support among white voters in southern states, but they have tried repeatedly to pull this off. And after John Brown's raid and Lincoln's threatened election, they think they can do it.
Did they do it? I mean,
in some states like Alabama and Georgia and others, there is in effect a coup d'etat.
Maybe in Virginia too.
Well, in Virginia, think about the timing. Firing in Fort Sumter on April 12th, and what happens immediately after the Confederates fire in that fort and compel its surrender?
they succeeded?
West Virginia.
A little later. But what's Lincoln's response to the fire? Well, he declares a blockade, but it's a paper blockade. You got 60 ships in the U.S. Navy, but most of them are in dry dock. Some of them are in Singapore. They're around the world. It takes some of the ships in the U.S. Navy 2 years to get back to America. So we have a very small Navy, and it's even smaller in theory as far as the ships that can go out in active service. There's simply not enough ships to effectively blockade more than a 1,000-mile coastline with thousands of inlets and estuaries, and you could put some warships off Charleston Harbor, but are you going to be able to blockade every port along the South Atlantic coastline or the Gulf of Mexico down to the Mexican border? No. It takes a while for that blockade to take effect. Now, the first thing that Lincoln does after the firing of Fort Sumter, he calls for 75,000 volunteers to subdue what he calls a local insurrection. This is just a localized disturbance. It's not a war. It's not a rebellion. It's just a minor affair in some southern states. And oh, by the way, I need 75,000 volunteers to subdue this trouble.
But he can't just say, we need them from Massachusetts, New York, and New England and the Northwest. He has to say, everybody that hasn't seceded, we need soldiers from your states as
And
well.
what law governs him? Why does he have to say that?
Constitution?
It's a militia act that was passed, I think, in the 1790s. What Lincoln is doing is calling out the state militia, in effect. I mean, he's calling for volunteers. Most clear-eyed people knew that state militias weren't too reliable. They're filled with superannuated characters, and they drill maybe 4 times a year, and some of them don't bring their muskets, and they march around in the sun for half an hour, and then they get tired, and they repair to the nearest tavern. The Massachusetts militia, I had a graduate student at UMass Boston that did an MA thesis on the Massachusetts militia, and he concluded that it was the best equipped, the best trained, and the most prepared militia in any of the northern states. They had reorganized it in 1860, and they had thrown out men who didn't show up for drills. They reduced the size of the militia, but the men that were in it when this reform ended were ready to go. So Lincoln calls for volunteers, and as Jim points out, he calls for volunteers not just from Massachusetts. He calls for volunteers from slave states that have not yet seceded, including North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Arkansas. And they, in effect, tell him, stick it in your ear. We're not going to send volunteers to suppress our sisters in the slave states to the south. We're not going to help you, northern dictator, you abolitionists, put down this fight for states' rights, for southern independence.
Michael, let me, as they say, essay an answer to the question of why did the South fire on Fort Sumter? And this is just my own idea, and I appreciate you commenting on it one way and another. It strikes me that there is, as Shakespeare said, there is a tide in the course of human events. Things, you get sucked in life by what's going on. You just keep going down the same path, and one thing leads to another, and leads to another, and leads to another, and without anybody ever stepping back and saying, whoa, whoa, where are we going here? My God, it's Obamacare. We're all end up socializing. You understand? That's when people pretend to look down the road. Well, you had this starting in 1787 with the Constitution and its slave provisions. And by the time the 1850s came along, they were screaming at each other. Guys were getting caned on the floor of the Senate. People began to think, this Lewis Kahn fight is a fight that everybody wants to see. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, members of Congress are coming armed, revolvers, derringers, knives, stilettos.
And it's very much, and here's the real crux of the thing as far as I'm concerned. If there's any merit to this position, it is not so different from Vietnam. It is not so different from Iraq after the first couple of weeks of Iraq. You get in, and it's not so different from what just happened in Libya. You keep hearing about it, you keep hearing we gotta do this, we gotta do that, you do this, you do that, that leads to something else. And by the time they fired on Fort Sumter, incidentally, that was the third, there had been 2 attempts to relieve Fort Sumter just by bringing in food. One, the guy turned back, and the second was the famous Star of the West.
They shot at it.
And they shot at it.
Cadets from the Citadel.
So, I mean, it was just, life and events take their course and they suck you in. And, maybe that had something to do with it.
Dean, could I ask you what you meant by slave provisions in the Constitution?
Well, what Mike referred to, which is that people have to be returned to service.
there's a provision, isn't that how it's worded? People who have fled service.
The even more important provision is that the membership of the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, is going to be apportioned based on the white population in the states and 3/5 of all others. Now, who were those 3/5? Who are we talking about? The word slavery doesn't appear in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, but the representation that the slave states got in the U.S. Congress and the House was higher, considerably higher than it would otherwise have been.
Even though they couldn't vote.
You know, when you get right down to it, Mike can go right down the years for you. That 3/5 provision, which was certainly by the 1840s and 50s anyway, a real bone of contention in the North, it assured that the federal government was under Southern control from 1790 through 1860, because they just had more Congress people. They elected. The presidents all came from Virginia for the first 30 or 40 years, or almost all, except for John Quincy Adams and John Adams. It just gave the South unlimited, not unlimited, but disproportionate power. And Mike, wasn't it the fear of losing the disproportionate power as you got non-slave territories brought into the Union as states, as Lincoln would have had it? This was a real concern to the South. It was going to lose its control over the American government, which I am bound to say it never has.
Now, when the 13th Amendment comes along, you can cross that 3/5 right up. That's just nullified by the 13th Amendment.
No. Because there are no such people.
It's not until the 14th and 15th.
Amendment.
The 14th, citizenship and due process, and the 15th, the right to vote for men only.
Yeah.
Somehow the suffragettes got left out. We don't know quite how that happened, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and the others were quite bitter about it. But the reward, here's the reward for treason that's given to the former Confederate States after 1870. Instead of 3/5 of their African American population being counted for representation purposes in the House, it's 5/5. So the southern states, the Confederate States, get an additional 15 to 20 representatives in the House.
And none of the black people can vote. That's the kicker.
Right.
And one of those amendments has a provision that if the rights are not protected and their right to vote is not respected and their citizenship rights, then the representation of such state can be reduced. That has never been enforced. It's a law with teeth in it, but it's never been enforced.
There is a provision in the Constitution which only a few of us antique characters know about, because reapportionment, it came up with reapportionment in 1961, 2, 3. The Constitution provides to every state a guarantee of a Republican form of government. Never enforced. Never enforced.
One man, one vote, except in the U.S. Senate. So Montana, Nevada, Montana, they got more sheep than people. And they've also got more senators than representatives. Actually, I think they do now have 2 representatives in Montana, but whether you're a huge state like California and New York, or a very small state like Rhode Island and Delaware, they all get 2 senators. That's not proportional. That doesn't conform to one man, one vote. It doesn't conform to the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling.
Well, and let me say, the U.S. Supreme Court, often never having the courage of reasonable convictions, such as with the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which I'm not going to get into, did not ground reapportionment on the Republican, on the guarantee of a Republican form of government. They grounded it under protection. So the Republican form of government clause has never been enforced, unless maybe Doer's Rebellion in 1848.
Don't go to Providence, don't go to the state capitol and tell the old tour guide in the building about Doer's Rebellion. Because one of these characters told me, rebellion? We never had a rebellion in Rhode Island. That was you Southerners, that was you rednecks down south. We didn't have no rebellion in Rhode Island. But Doer's Rebellion was a fight between 2 parties, 2 groups in Rhode Island in the state legislature for control of the state. So they had a little small-scale insurrection in Rhode Island.
Isn't there another provision in the Constitution, though, that implies that slavery was supposed to end in 1808?
That was the slave trade, the transatlantic trade.
Did that imply that the framers thought slavery would be phased out within 20 years after the ratification?
Lincoln, in his Cooper Union speech early in 1861 in New York City, Lincoln did a lot of historical research, and he found evidence that convinced him that the framers of the Constitution and the founders of the country wanted slavery to go away. Maybe they weren't abolitionists, but they were anti-slavery. They put measures in place to do away with it gradually, and one of the provisions in the Constitution said that the international slave trade could be banned in this country, but no sooner than 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. And that ninth state ratifies, and then you get the 10th in 1788. And 20 years after that date, January 1st, 1809, you could no longer legally bring slaves into this country from outside.
You know, we haven't mentioned it yet today, but I don't think anybody would gainsay that we have Britain and the Royal Navy to thank for the ending of the slave trade.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the Royal Navy was after these guys. I just read yesterday or 2 days ago that the last ship that was captured, the last two slave ships that were captured, were I think in 1859 and 1860. And if I remember correctly, the Royal Navy would take them, I may not remember correctly, I think the Royal Navy would take them to London and they'd be hung from Execution Dock, if you've ever been in London, where they hung the pirates. So it was and Wilberforce. You know, there's a major basketball power in Ohio, Wilberforce University, and I guess that's named after Wilberforce.
Oh yeah.
He was responsible in England for the beginning of abolition, and then it jumped the pond, as they say.
Going on right now.
The publisher, I first met her at a Civil War forum hosted by Dean Velvo at the law school in Andover. And she's a friend of all things Civil War, as is Helen. Contrary to what Dean Mooney said, I'm not going to be the speaker today, but I do hope to be sort of the facilitator of a discussion. Some of you know a lot about the war, some of you know perhaps less, but you wouldn't be here if you didn't have an interest, perhaps a curiosity about the war. So I'm just going to throw out some simple questions, and then at the end there'll be a test. And my first question for all comers, what caused the Civil War? Slavery.
No. Secession.
Yeah, succession.
What caused secession?
States' rights.
States' rights. What rights were they protecting in particular?
They wanted to expand the slavery, the Southwest Land slavery, past the Mississippi River into the new territories. Abe Lincoln didn't have, from what I understand, didn't have a problem with the states where slavery existed. I mean, he didn't like the idea, but more than anything else, he wanted to stop the expansion beyond the Mississippi to the West Coast.
Actually, there's been a whole new movement that people are coming back that it was slavery that caused it, because in every state constitution, slavery was included. I haven't read it yet, but Eric Foner is kind of leading the presentation of this. Again, at one of Larry Belvo's Civil War seminars at the School of Law, James McPherson gave a really wonderful seminar, and he also brought up that people didn't want to admit that their ancestors were fighting for something like slavery, and so going for the lost cause was glorious, whereas going for slavery was not. This is all brand new that people are taking this theory, and so it's very exciting because it's exciting because it's changing what people have been saying for 100 years, and it's literally brand new. So if you've been saying states' rights, that's what everyone else has been saying for years. But it's going to be kind of interesting to see how it's responded to.
Someone else?
Yeah, didn't states' rights have something to do with this?
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the American College of History and Legal Studies. It's great to see so many of you here this morning on a Saturday to hear from an expert on the Civil War. As you know, today's seminar is entitled The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. My name is Maureen Mooney. I'm the Associate Dean of the College, and at this time, I'm going to introduce the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law for some brief remarks. The Massachusetts School of Law is the creator of the American College, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dean Lawrence Velvel.
Hello, folks. Thank you. We'll see if you clap when I finish. Dubious in the extreme. How many of you, if any, have gone to our law school? Okay, so I'll try not to be too repetitive. We started the law school in 1988. Its object was to provide legal education and economic and social opportunity to people who were being frozen out in those days. I think we've succeeded very well. We have 3,000 graduates now. And a couple of years ago, and we use particular techniques which I think cause people to become far better intellectually, far better thinkers, far better readers, far better writers, far better speakers. And a few years ago, we decided that we were going to bring those same techniques to undergraduate education. And let me mention, by the way, low price, because our tuition's only $15,000 at the law school, when all around us it's 35, 40, 45, and 50,000 in New England. So we decided to bring the same techniques to undergraduate education in the hope of, providing opportunity to people, making them better thinkers, better speakers, better writers, and very importantly, giving them a knowledge of American history. I have never yet met a historian who does not think that Americans know far too little about their own history, and correlatively that this has an impact, most think an adverse impact, I believe, on what the country does politically, both domestically and internationally. So that was the hope in starting.
What I've given you is many different types of history. So there's some regimental histories. There are monographs about women in the Civil War, about African American soldiers, various topics, economic history, diplomatic history. The Civil War is a universe all to itself, and it's connected with everything else in our history. And I preach big tent Civil War because no matter what you're interested in, for me, there's room under the tent. I'll be referring perhaps to some of those titles as we go along. The other handout, just one page, front and back. If you don't like history, or maybe you think you don't like history, probably because you haven't been exposed to really good history, maybe you prefer fiction, novels. This is a selection of Civil War novels, and again, written from different points of view, different topics, different periods, different theaters of the war, including the war within a war in Missouri, very violent, very bitter. Most of those books are available in paperback, and most of them you can get online. I hate to say this for independent booksellers, but you can get them from Amazon and other online vendors, and you can get them very inexpensively. Helen?
Don't forget Harvard Bookstore. You can get them, I'm sorry to interrupt. If you go to Harvard Bookstore, not the Coop, but the Harvard Bookstore on Mass Ave, they have this great big copier that if it's on Google, that you can get them from like $10, $20, and they're real paperbacks. And you can do it over the phone too. You don't have to actually go there. Sorry, it's just that we were talking about it on the way.
Would you tell them about Civil War news?
I would like to tell you about it. This is a newspaper that comes out 11 times a year. This, if you want to be up on what's going on, the enactments and preservation causes, this is the newspaper to have. And also, so I won't forget it, you will get a discount if you mention that you attended this seminar. And so don't forget to do that. But if you're interested, we have the name and address. We can give it to you. But for me, the best parts are the book reviews. But there's a lot of information, and it's been around for like 20 years, and I highly recommend it. It will give you a whole dimension of what's going on.
The ACHLS, where all the teaching, as in the law school, is discussion teaching, no lecturing, where there's 4 hours of writing a semester that is conjoined with the substantive courses, where there is no hiding because there's only a few students in a class and everybody is required to speak up every day in every way and on every subject. That's a slight exaggeration, but not much. And Mike Chesson and Andrea DeFusco-Sullivan, where are you, Andrea, are the folks who teach these people.
I'm here, Dean.
Oh, there she is. She's the writing teacher. So as part of our program here at the school, we're giving this Civil War seminar. Mike Chesson and I are joined at the hip when it comes to the Civil War. And I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Dean Velvel. I'm going to read now the biography of our speaker today, Dr. Michael Chesson. And it's so impressive that I have to read it so I don't miss any detail. So our seminar today will be led again by Dr. Michael Chesson. Michael Chesson was born in Richmond, Virginia, in the shadow of the White House of the Confederacy. He graduated from the College of William and Mary, magna cum laude, in history. After active duty in the U.S. Navy, from which he retired as a captain in the U.S. Navy Reserve, he began graduate work at the Johns Hopkins University with the late David Herbert Donald, following him to Harvard, where he got his Ph.D. He left the University of the Massachusetts, UMass Boston, where he was the senior Americanist in the Department of History and its former chair, after 32 years, to become both the founding professor and the dean of the American College of History and Legal Studies. He has written or edited 4 books and dozens of articles and book reviews. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michael Chesson.
Thank you, Maureen, and thanks for coming on Saturday morning. You should have a couple of handouts in your folders, and the first is some recommended reading, and this is not intended to be the 75 best books on the Civil War. It's a highly personal and idiosyncratic list, but I begin with some reference works and general histories, and then on pages 2, 3, and 4, well, explain.
Well, each state wanted to govern itself, have its own rules, not be forced into deciding to have slavery or not to have slavery, to govern themselves without the interference of the federal government. And I thought in all the books that I've read that did enter a big portion of it, and this gentleman brought it up.
Someone else? Dave.
Through an economist lens, in the South, their economic well-being, their quality of life, their living standards were predominantly dependent on an agricultural society, and having slave labor to go off and plant and tend and harvest the crops was great economic benefit. The idea of taking slavery away and forcing the landed gentry to have to pay for labor to harvest their crops to raise their costs of maintaining their cost of living probably had a very personal and financial incentive for the folks that were pro-slavery. And the idea that there were folks who were against it.
And pro-power too. I think they would have been the state legislators because they were the money people, so they would have been in politics. I agree that economics had a huge part to do with it because they had a model that was working for them. It wasn't working for the poor whites or for the African Americans, but
no,
it was working, and they were the ones in power in the South Carolina legislator and other legislators. That's what I believe.
Mary?
Yes, I think the economics, as you said, comes up to here, to New England and New York and everywhere, that a lot of people up here depended upon the cotton too for economic reasons, the shippers and certainly the mills and rolls. And that old saying, money loves money, or money likes money, money marries money. A lot of the North and the South, you know, it was good if a Southern belle married a Northern industrialist, because of economic reasons.
I agree it's about economics too. It's really about economics. I think the Industrial Revolution was coming up, and slavery would not have worked for that, to have to take care of labor when it wasn't working. So I think it's strongly economics and about property rights also.